Good morning. I'm Jo Ann Stancil. I'm doing the Bible study overview for Experiencing God for Unit 7. As you can see on the board, Unit 7 is entitled Crisis of Belief. Crisis of Belief. And if you look at this poster, you can see all the steps we are working on for experiencing God. The crisis of belief is step number 5, and we will quote that in just a minute. But I wanted to give you just the day's overview for what you're going to hear about on the board. Dr. Blackaby defines for us why the crisis of belief is a turning point, and we'll talk about that from day 1. He then goes into day 2, which is encounters with God requires faith. Day 3 is encounters with God or God-sized. Day 4 is what you do reveals what you believe. And day 5 is true faith requires action. Okay, so crisis of belief. If you notice on those 5 days, things get a little heavier and a little heavier as we move along. It starts with information, but by the end, it's requiring action, and that's how our lesson will go today as we overview this week's study. Dr. Blackaby starts out with Hebrews 11:6, and that verse says, "Without faith, it is impossible to please God." He then gives us this paragraph that I think is important to read. This unit focuses on a major turning point in following God's will. When God invites you to join Him in His work, He has a God-sized assignment for you. You will quickly realize you cannot do what He is asking you to do on your own. If God doesn't help you, you will fail. This is the crisis of belief when you must decide whether to believe God for what He wants to do through you. So reality 5, as you've seen in the chart above my head, says, God's invitation for you to work with Him always leads to a crisis of belief that requires faith and action. That statement is what we're going to talk about today. Always leads to a crisis of belief. Everything God asks us to do leads to a crisis of belief. Now, the word crisis sounds like a strong word, but it's kind of a relative term. Depending on the task, it's a different size crisis. You know, I looked at the paper this morning, and you probably did too, about Dr. Graham's death. And Dr. Graham had a crisis of belief in his life when God called him into the ministry, and then called him to be the evangelist of the world, to share the gospel of Christ around the world. Dr. Graham chose that crisis of belief to be with God, and his faith in action was being an evangelist for over 60 years. That was a turning point in Dr. Graham's life. The term crisis of belief can be better understood if you think of it as a turning point. All of us have turning points every day. You know, yesterday, I shared in class last night, yesterday I had to get up at 5:30 in the morning to get the outline for this class done. I had to type it that morning, get my headset, make copies. Then I had to spend the afternoon visiting in hospitals, and last night teaching. Now, my crisis of belief, my turning point was Tuesday night when I had to decide what my schedule was going to be the next day. Was I going to do all for God that I felt Him calling me to do, excuse me, to do it right and the best I could? And that schedule was my crisis of belief that day. You know, it wasn't like a Dr. Graham decision to be the evangelist to the world, sharing the gospel around the world. But then I made a commitment, a turning point commitment, to do all I could, to do the best lesson I could for experiencing God. So the way you live your life is a testimony of what you believe about God. That's a pretty obvious conclusion that Dr. Blackaby has given us. But some people will argue with that, won't they? And they will say, I don't believe that, and I don't live that way. Well, you have to ask them, does your life tell me you believe in God and you're living your life for God, or does the way you live your life tell me you don't believe in God and it's all about you? Dr. Blackaby gives great examples in the first day of how his church had to live out this crisis of belief. He gives an example on page 135, the first paragraph, of how his church was grappling for what they believed their budget could be. And that first paragraph on page 135 says they had prayed about what their budget should be, and yet they knew what they could afford it to be, what the tithes and offerings were going to be. But they chose the challenge budget because that's where God was leading them. That was their crisis of belief, and they chose that challenge budget, which they met that year by God's grace. He also gives another example where his church, wanted to start a lot of missions. And in this one town, they found this building, and the building was going to cost $9,000. And yet they had no money to buy this building. But in faith, they told the man, give us 2 weeks. We're going to pray and see if God will provide the money. So they prayed and prayed and prayed. And then this church in Texas called and said, we have $5,000 that we want to give towards a mission church, and we have heard all the way down in Texas that you're starting a mission church, and we would like to send you $5,000 and commit $200 a month towards the pastor's salary. Henry Blackaby just thanked God for that, because that was the first step towards meeting the challenge of buying this building for the new mission church. 2 days later, another Texas woman called and said, I have $1,000 I want to send you because I hear that you're starting a mission church, and I really want to support that. Again, Dr. Blackaby was so grateful and so thankful, and he went back to the church and said, we now have $6,000. So they go back to the owner and say, we have $6,000, and he said, that is perfect. Because with taxes and interest rates, I've decided that's all the down payment I want from you at this point. And so God had answered their prayer, and they had the building. It wasn't what they could accomplish. It's what God accomplished in their lives, that God-sized task. Blackaby then says in day 1, what you believe about God will determine what you do. When God tells you what he wants to do through you, you will face a crisis of belief. What you do next reveals what you believe about God. Wow. And so in the building crisis that Dr. Blackaby's church went through, they believed God wanted them to have that building for a new mission church. And they didn't back down. They asked for 2 weeks to pray about it and let God work. And God came through. There are some biblical crises of belief that I want us to look at this morning. And the first one that Dr. Blackaby calls us to is in Joshua 6, 1 through 5. Listen to this crisis of belief. Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once. Then you shall do it for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priest shall blow the trumpets. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, and everyone straight before him. Wow. Here is Joshua leading the people into Israel, and God is telling them how they're going to take the city of Jericho, a big city in Jericho with a wall all the way around it. And God gives him this phenomenal plan. You are going to march around the city once, the whole army, for 6 days, once every day. But then on the seventh day, you are going to march around the city, what did he say, 7 times? Then the priests were going to blow the trumpets and the ram's horn. The people would shout, and the walls would come down. Was that a crisis of belief for Joshua? You bet it was. And how about the children of Israel? They might have thought Joshua had lost their mind. But their leader was faithful to God, and he did exactly what God called him to do. And he led the people to do what they did, and they took the city of Jericho. Then the next story he wants us to look at is in Judges 6 and 7. Listen at Judges 6:33. Now all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east came together, and they crossed the Jordan and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. Now, what this is telling us is all of the residents of this area are coming together. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and the people of the east are coming together to stand up against the great army of Israel. Now listen to the rest of the story. And this starts in Judges 7, and we'll read 1 through 8. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Morah in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, "The people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, 'My own hand has saved me.' Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, 'First, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead.' 22,000 of the 32,000 turned and ran. 10,000 remained. And the Lord said to Gideon, 'The people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And anyone of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, and this one shall not, listen.' So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, 'Everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set him by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink.' And the number of those who lapped, putting their hands in their mouth, were 300 men. But all of the rest of the people knelt down to drink water like a dog. And the Lord said to Gideon, 'With the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go, every man to his home.'" Now, is that a crazy plan or what? Is that a God-sized plan? He had 32,000 men. 22,000 turned and ran. And out of 10,000, God kept 300. And they beat the Midianites and the Amalekites. That's a God-sized plan. But you notice the reason why God did that? He said, "I don't want you to be able to say it was you saved yourself by your own hand. I want you to be able to say and proclaim, God saved us." And that's exactly what happened. The third story that Dr. Blackaby in day one wanted us to look at was in Matthew 17, and this has to do with Peter and the tax. When they, that's Jesus and the disciples, came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" Peter said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" And when he said, "From others," Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself." Wow. Jesus decided that to pay the tax on that day, he was sending Peter the fisherman out to the lake to cast a line, and the first fish he caught, he was to look in his mouth, and when he did, there was a shekel there to pay their tax. That was a God-sized task for Peter, to believe that he was going to find a coin in the mouth of a fish. So God's calling us. So step one, it's a turning point. And in these three stories, the lead person, whether it was Joshua, Gideon, or Peter, had a turning point in their life. So day two, then, Blackaby says, we have encounters with God that require faith. Blackaby says to us, when God speaks, your response requires faith. If you're a Christian, if you're a believer in the Holy God, it requires faith. Faith is confidence that what God promised or said will come to pass. Sight is the opposite of faith. So when God speaks to you and I, we have a challenge. Are we going to believe in what we see or what God is saying? And that's a challenge in this day and time. Faith is confidence. Your faith does not rest on a concept or an idea. Instead, your faith rests in a person, and that is God the Creator. Faith is valid only in God and what He says He is purposing to do. You know, Blackaby says this statement: Moses could not deliver the children of Israel from Pharaoh's army by himself. He could not cross the Red Sea on dry land on his own. He could not produce water from a rock or provide bread and meat for the children of Israel as they crossed the desert. Moses had to have faith that the God who called him would do what he said he would do. And God did. In the same vein, Joshua could not take the Israelites across the Jordan River on dry land. Joshua could not bring down walled cities. He could not defeat the enemies in the promised land or make the sun stand still. Only God could accomplish these things. Joshua had to have faith in God, and he did. When God lets you know what He wants to do through you, it will be something only He can do. What you believe about God will determine what you do next. Remember that verse, Hebrews 11:6. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. And here's a true-false that you need to think about and maybe want to ask your class about. Blackaby says disobedience often reveals lack of faith. True? I think it is. When we choose to disobey God, it is because it's a lack of faith on our part. He ends day two with this wonderful story that his church, it's on page 140, and it's about calling a man named Lynn to be a pastor of their new mission church, a new mission church. They started many new mission churches. Lynn was a bivocational pastor. He had been working for 14 years at a gas station, and he was part-time so that he could pastor another small church. He and his wife had been saving money for 14 years, and they had managed to save $7,000 as a down payment on a home. Dr. Blackaby calls and wants Lynn to come to be pastor of their new church. And Lynn says, I would like to pray about it, but I will let you know. And Blackaby says, Lynn, the one thing that you need to understand is we have no money to pay you. We don't know how we're going to pay you yet. And so Lynn says, let my wife and I pray about this, and I'll call you back. And so Lynn and his wife prayed, and in fact, the book says he prayed all night, and his wife. And they decided that the $7,000 that they had saved for a down payment on a home was really God's money. And he told Dr. Blackaby that he and his wife would use that money to live on as they came. And after they got there, then they would figure out how they were going to make an income. Let me share this paragraph from the book because I think it's beautiful. Lynn said, Henry, the God who has called me will help me. We will take the money from our savings and we will move. Later, Lynn came into my office and said, Henry, my wife and I prayed and talked all night. I have worked bivocationally for 14 years, and I have no problem working to provide for my family. But the need here is so great and God's direction is so clear, I believe I need to work full-time. My wife and I realized last night that the $7,000 we have in the bank is God's, and He wants us to use that for our living expenses. When we have exhausted that, He will show us what to do next. Dr. Blackaby says when Lynn left the room, he got down on the floor with his face down and cried because of God's abundant mercy and movement on Lynn's life. 2 days later, Dr. Blackaby receives a letter from a Presbyterian layman in another part of Canada. And guess how much money this layman sent Dr. Blackaby? $7,000. And he called Lynn and said, Lynn, God has provided the money in a bush, and you are not going to have to use your savings to live on. Again, Dr. Blackaby said, I wept because God knew exactly what they were doing and what their plans were, and He chose to bless that ministry. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Day 3, as you can see behind me, centers around encounters with God or God-sized. God is interested in the world coming to know Him. The only way people will know what God is like is to see Him at work in their world. The assignments God gave the people in the Bible were always God-sized. They were always beyond what people could do in their strength because He wanted to demonstrate His nature, His strength, His provision, and His love to not only those people, but everyone watching to see what was going on. You know what happened with Moses and Joshua? Blackaby goes on to talk about King Jehoshaphat. When he knew he had to stand up against the enemy, he called the people together to pray and fast before they went to battle. When they finally got there, God had already defeated the enemy before they even got there. What a praise. And how about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel's friends that were taken to Babylon? They refused to worship Nebuchadnezzar's idol. And for that, they were thrown in a fiery furnace. And yet, when they were pulled out the next morning, they didn't smell of smoke, the Scripture says, and not a hair on their body was singed. They survived the fiery furnace for obedience to God. The early church. You remember what happened in the early church in the book of Acts? when they were obedient to God and prayed after Jesus has ascended into heaven, and clothes of fire came down on their heads, and the disciples were speaking in languages they had never, ever spoken before. They had not studied. These were not studied men. And they were talking, and people around them recognized different languages. Excuse me. And then Peter preached. And when Peter preached, 3,000 were saved. That was a God-sized task. And then later on in the book of Acts, Peter and John healed a crippled beggar, a God-sized task. So when people saw God at work through his servants, who received the credit? God did. What difference or impact do you see in the lives of people who saw or heard God's activities? The scripture is full of people that saw, and like when Peter preached, they came, they were saved, they believed. And that's God's point in his work. Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. God's story. Dr. Blackaby has another story in day 3 that is just a phenomenal story. Their church needed to expand. It was growing. This is on page 145. The expansion was going to cost them $200,000. They didn't even have $1,000 in their checking account or in their building fund. They did a campaign. They got $100,000. They were $100,000 short. Well, they had applied to a foundation in Texas for some support. The money didn't come on time. When the check finally got there, the exchange rate in Canada had gone down so that the dollar was at its lowest point in Canada. When that check from the foundation was put in their account, it actually gave them $60,000 more than they needed. What a God-sized moment. So day 4 then, Dr. Blackaby leads us to discover what you do reveals what you believe. But he starts out by saying, true faith requires action. And he gives us 2 opposite examples. The first example is with the life of David in 1 Samuel 16 and 17. You will remember in 16 that Samuel, the prophet, was called to anoint a new king. Saul was king, but God was calling for a new king. And so he went to the family of David. And he went and looked at every one of David's brothers and finally said, it's none of these. Do you have any other sons? And David's father said, well, I have the youngest son, but he's out keeping sheep. He's a shepherd. He said, please bring him in. And when he brought him in, Samuel knew this was the man he was to anoint. And so Samuel is anointed king. Of course, he's a young man. Saul is still alive, so he doesn't take the throne at that point. But God is forming his life to do what God is going to do when he is anointed king. And so in 17, it's that great story of David and Goliath. David comes as directed by his father just to bring his brothers who are fighting food. And when he gets there, he realizes that the Philistine army with the giant 9-foot man Goliath is intimidating the Israelites. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth. And he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, mocked him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give you flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with the sword and with the spear and with the javelin, and I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, and all that may know that there is a God of Israel. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into his hands. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The same stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. Most of you know he cut his head off and he was dead. A God-sized experience for a teenager. Only God could have equipped David to do that. God delivered. Then the other story that Blackaby shares with us is the story of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And you know in Genesis 15:4-6 is where God promises Abraham that his descendants will be as the stars are in heaven. Well, Sarah doesn't quite get that. And she's a rebellious child. And so in Genesis 16, 1-3, she takes things into her own hands. And she does this. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said to Abram, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, it may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. Sarah's actions said exactly what she believed about God. Because she was old, the scripture said she was 70 at this point. She was past childbearing years. She didn't think God could do what he promised Abraham. And so she took things into her own hands and gave Hagar to Abram. You and I know from the scripture that when Ishmael was born, there was a constant fighting between Sarah and she ended up leaving. She disobeyed God. There were other examples in the book that Dr. Blackaby shared with us. A couple, Bill and Kathy, who were called to be missionaries. They had prayed about it. They felt God's calling. And because they had grandchildren, the only grandchildren to her parents, they didn't feel like that they could go overseas and take the grandchildren from her parents. Lavona in his church was praying about how God could use her. The church came to her and said, we need you to teach a new Sunday school class. She turned it down and said, I don't have the ability to do that. Calvary Church, who was asked to start a new mission church by Blackaby's church, decided not to do it because they said, we need to pay off our church debt first. First Baptist Church of that area prayed about it and presented a challenge budget. The deacons did a capital campaign or a campaign to raise pledges. It was 10% short, and so they cut the budget to meet what the commitments were. Actions speak. Those examples show it. But then Blackaby ends this day, day 4, with the success stories, other success stories in the Bible. In Matthew 8, when the centurion walks up to Jesus and said, Jesus, my son is sick. I believe that you can heal him, but I'm a centurion, and you should not come into my home as a man of God. By your word, I know you can heal him. And Jesus turned to him and said, your son is made whole because of your faith. Another story in Matthew 8 is when Jesus and the disciples are in the boat on the lake. You and I know that story, and the bad storm comes up. Jesus is asleep in the front of the boat. The disciples are scared. They wake Jesus up. Some people think to help them row. But God used Jesus to calm the storm and to teach the disciples, to raise their expectations of him even higher, because he was the master of the sea. In Matthew 9, there was a story of a woman who had an issue of blood for years. Jesus came to her town, and her faith was strong enough that she believed, and she was desperate enough that if she reached out and touched just the hem of Christ's garment, she could be healed. And she was healed by Jesus. And then 2 blind men asked Jesus to heal them, and he did it. Again, Blackaby says, what I do in response to God's revelation says what I believe about God. On the last day, Dr. Blackaby reiterates that true faith requires action. True faith requires action. And he quotes James 2:26. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead. When you face a crisis of belief, what you do demonstrates what you believe. We've said that 3 or 4 times already. And then in Hebrews 12:1-3, Blackaby quotes the writer. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. He quotes that for this reason. He said, outward appearances of success do not always indicate faith, and outward appearances of failure do not always reflect a lack of faith. And his example is Christ. Christ was crucified for his faith, for the way he lived his life. And he wants us to remember that appearances only don't give the answer. Faith is the answer. I want us, as we close today, just to remember Dr. Billy Graham and the God-sized task that he accomplished in his life of 99 years. This morning in the paper, it said in his 60-year career, 210 million people heard the gospel. He preached, and this sounds phenomenal, to people from 185 countries around the world. He led 417 crusades. And all of that, he was also chaplain, the unofficial White House chaplain during his years of ministry. We give praise for God calling us, calling the people that we have recorded in the Bible, calling Dr. Graham. And we can celebrate today that you and I are called every day to do God-sized tasks because he is able and we can be faithful.